welcome to the Motivational Millennial Podcast, where we interview inspiring members of the millennial generation who are living life with a sense of purpose and achieving their dreams. I'm Blake Brandis.
And I'm Ivy LeClaire.
Our Motivational Millennial guest today is Greg Clunas. Greg is a content creator, author, speaker, and entrepreneur. He's the creator and host behind Tiny Leaps, Big Changes, a top-ranked self-help podcast with over 2 million downloads, where he helps people change their life by focusing on making changes to their day-to-day behavior. Greg is also the founder of Pod Simply, a digital education and services platform where his team helps individuals and businesses launch and grow podcasts that get noticed, attract an audience, and generate sales. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Pumped to be here.
We appreciate you being on. You are an inspiration for us, and we're so glad to finally get a chance to hear your wisdom on our show. And so, Greg,
I wouldn't call it wisdom, but okay.
Your thoroughly researched opinions. How about that? Yeah, man, this has been so long coming. So would you mind sharing with us what you're up to at the moment and what you love so much about it?
Yeah, so the big thing for me right now is taking actually the two areas that have worked really well. So Tiny Leaps, this community and brand and podcast that has been turned into a book and a bunch of other things, taking that as well as the business side of I know how to launch podcasts well, and I can help others do that, and sort of pushing them together under a single personal brand rather than two separate things, so that I'm serving one audience, I'm serving one type of person that can benefit from the stuff that I offer. And then doubling down on the personal brand. So one of my big goals this year is to venture off into the YouTube game and into Instagram and the other platforms outside of podcasting that I have yet to crack. But once I do, I'll be doing it in a big way.
Sweet. And would you mind sharing some of the journey of how Tiny Leaps, Big Changes got started? I know you had a kind of different take on personal development, specifically a research-based take. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Sure. So it's actually interesting. So I've been podcasting now for a little over 4 years, I believe. And this show in particular, I've been hosting for 2. But I launched my first show 4 years ago, absolutely hated it. And part of the reason was I was trying to follow this specific format of a specific podcaster, and it just wasn't me. It didn't resonate with what I wanted to create. So I shut that down, started working with clients, helping them navigate the process, launched a second show, which did relatively well and was a lot more fun. That was called Casual Conversations with Awesome People. And the goal was just to speak with interesting people, but not have any necessary direction I was taking it, and see what came out of that. Ran that for a season, shut it down, took about a year break from hosting my own shows and just helped other people launch their shows. And then towards the end of 2015, December of 2015, I had just quit my job. And I was reading this book. I was on the train with my girlfriend. We're heading to date night to the opera. And I was reading this book that a friend of mine actually wrote. It was self-published and it was in his release period. So I wanted to help him and purchased it, whatever. Was reading through it and I felt like this is dangerous. And what I mean by that, so the concept of the book was that if you find what you love, your life will be perfect and you'll always be happy to wake up and XYZ. That was the core thesis. And so I read about 75% of the book thinking, at some point he's going to bring in that it doesn't actually work that way, but it's still good to pursue something you love. But he never did. He made this thesis of life will be perfect. And then he used all these different examples to back it up. And every single person in that book, they were all friends of mine, the people he mentioned. And I knew for a fact they came from relatively privileged backgrounds. And so the whole thing came across to me as a book that was spewing this message that doesn't actually play out in reality based on the experiences of people who had safety nets of some kind, but it was being sold to people who did not have that background. And it wasn't being made clear, hey, these people have a particular background that allows them to do this. And so I just got frustrated. And I remember I was sitting on the train and my girlfriend, I'm super lucky to have her because I just complained about it the entire date. This is dangerous, this is bad. You need to do something. I was just so frustrated. And so I made this commitment that night that I was going to launch something that focused on what you needed to do next Tuesday or next Wednesday, like the specific day-to-day stuff you needed to do to change your life. And so that's where it started. A couple days later, that night I journaled about it, journaled a couple of nights after that about it, trying to sort through the idea. And I came upon this concept of adding in research into it because I didn't want to come across, and this is my big fear in the personal development space, I didn't want to come across as a guru. I didn't want to come across as a life coach. Like, I was 23 at the time. I didn't want to seem as though I was trying to tell the 37-year-old single mother of 3 how she should live her life. Like, that's not my place. And so I wanted to approach it from the point of view of, this is the information and you can do with that whatever you like. Here's how I'm utilizing it, but it's your decision to decide how you want to use that factual information. And so I started researching all of these like different documents and research studies from the 40s and 60s and like the 20th century. And what I came to realize was that so much of human behavior comes down to all the different biases that we have and our lineage, if you look back through like the hunter-gatherer period. And so it started to form this thesis of, we all know what we want to do. The reason we don't do it is because of these like psychological and physiological things. If we can better understand that, then all of a sudden we can hack our way to doing more. And so that's how the show became what currently is my effort to take these like fairly basic things that we all struggle with and make them as easy as possible for people to execute on by either showing personal experience. So this is me experimenting and here's my results, or by diving into the research and sharing, this is how your brain processes information. Here's how you can interrupt that. This is how meditation affects the white matter in your brain and what white matter does. And here's how we can utilize that for our own benefit. And so giving people these, like, I hate the term life hacks, but that's almost what it ends up being, like these small things they can do to almost trick themselves into taking the action they know they should.
How do you feel that having a research-based personal development perspective has affected your audience in a way that may be different than the other perspective of just like, if pursue something you love and it's going to be great and perfect? I mean, it's interesting, this question in my mind is I'm wondering how people are what kind of people are attracted to the research-based, and how do you think that positively affects people who are interested in personal development but are wanting something that is a little bit more substantive?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so 2 things here. One, so I did an episode 179 of the show. It was called "This Is Not Self-Help," and in it was kind of just a rant. The whole thing that I was trying to get across in that episode, and it ended up being the most controversial and the most popular episode. The whole thing I was trying to get across is that self-help as an industry has sort of created this little bubble of people who are a part of it, and then there's the people who aren't a part of it. And what that ends up doing is there are plenty of people out there who want to improve the quality of their life, who want to have a better career, who want to be in better shape, but they don't consider themselves self-help people because they don't want to buy the books or attend the seminars or pay $10,000 to see Tony Robbins. They feel like they can't enter this world. And that to me is unfortunate because there's so much that can help so many people out there navigate the waters of just changing the quality of their life, whether it's by 1% or by 100%. If more people were open to exploring this space. And so I got on this rant of like tearing down this wall of self-help, of this us versus them mentality that really only serves to sell more conference tickets and make it less of a thing we do and more of a just us living life with the goal of making progress, which humans have done forever. That's the whole reason we live in cities and have the quality of life that we have, is because at some point we were cavemen, and throughout the millennia, we've made progress. That's what humans are wired to do. So it's really not a specific thing we need to put on our calendar and schedule out. Like, it's just living our life with some sense of, how do I move forward? And to the second point of how that has affected people, I've gotten so many emails, and this is the most humbling thing to me, but I've gotten so many emails from people that have told me they've been hesitant to start meditating because they thought it was like woo-woo nonsense, or they've been hesitant to do X, Y, or Z. And hearing the research aspect of it, starting to think of something like meditation that, has its roots in like Zen, third eye, spiritual awareness type of thing, but really has like very practical effects, almost similar to working out in the gym. When you start to think about it that way, it's so much easier to jump in. Like, you don't have to buy into the spirituality of it if that's not your thing. You can just look at it as training yourself to focus, or getting more patience, or expanding your brain's ability to communicate with the different sides. And so I think having that research piece or personal experience piece of my own experience or the people I bring on, and really driving them to get practical with it rather than this high level idea that we all sort of hear everywhere and on Instagram, I think it makes it more accessible for a lot of people.
And thinking about that personal experience piece, I know some of your most popular episodes have been where you have shared some of the things that you're going through in the moment. What has that been like for you, being in that space of vulnerability and seeing people's response to it?
It's been weird, to be honest. I've never been the type of person that like feels like I need to hold everything to my chest. Like, I'm fairly open. But okay, so one of the best received series of episodes I've ever done, my father passed away back in October. And the next day, at the push of my aunt who listens to the show, I decided I was just going to get on the microphone and talk about it. I actually intended at the time to do it like once a week and like document this process of dealing with grief and yada, yada, yada. That ended up being way too hard. And so I didn't do the next one until maybe 7 weeks later. But in the first one, I'd asked people not to reach out to me. I didn't want to hear the condolences and yada, yada, yada. Like, I know they're coming from a good place, but it almost made it hurt more. And in the second one, I didn't have that message. And at that point, I felt like I could deal with it. And I got flooded after that second one with all these people that were like, I wanted to reach out to you after the first, but you asked me not to. But here's my story. Like, I lost my dad 6 months ago, and here's how I've been dealing with it. And here's books that have helped me. And people just saying that it helps them so much to hear my thoughts, because it's like putting words to the things they've been feeling but not been able to express, and just stuff that I honestly did not expect to happen. Like, when I was recording both of them, I felt like I'm being selfish. Like, I'm using this person's time to talk about my own feelings instead of providing them value. I didn't recognize how much value it actually provides to share just your journey and what you're dealing with, and how much value it is to give somebody someone to relate back to. Until I released that episode and got all these emails of support and them sharing their own story with me, and people sharing even worse stories and opening up to me in a way that I don't even feel qualified to help with, but they just feel like they trust me. So it's been a really weird ride, like a really weird roller coaster of just not entirely knowing how to deal with it and do my best to help others, but then being stunned and so incredibly appreciative of being given the opportunity to share that story of my dad passing, or whatever it might be in the future.
That's such a great gift that you're giving, because I think one of the things that can be so challenging or damaging is when we isolate ourselves and we feel like we are the only ones experiencing this certain type of pain or this type of experience. And so, by sharing that, your audience was able to get a shared human experience. And then you are also able to get that shared human experience through them. Yeah. So that's a really beautiful story.
100%. And it's definitely not something I expected. Like I said, I felt like, oh, I'm being selfish here, but it turned out to be anything but.
Greg, what have been some of the biggest challenges for you? I mean, obviously that sounds like a major personal challenge, but I guess in terms of your journey of getting to where you are and building this community and finding things that you really care about and that are meaningful to you, what have been some of the biggest challenges you faced along the way?
I would say coming to terms with myself. And what I mean by that is back in high school, and this is going to be a short detour. Back in high school, I was a fairly shy person. Like I was not an open, share myself type of person. And I remember sophomore year thinking, like I always had this vision of who I wanted to be in the future. I always knew like the direction I wanted to go in. And I couldn't see how the version of who I was then mapped to this version I had in my head. And so I knew that I had to get over the shyness. I had to like be more outgoing and be more willing to share and communicate and so on and so forth. And so I forced myself to do performances. I did musical theater in high school. I actually helped found our musical theater program that had shut down like 10 years prior. I did band, I did choir, I auditioned for like the honors choir and just did anything that forced me to perform in front of other people. I forced myself to do. And that was a rule that I carried with me. And then in college, I did the same thing, even when it terrified me. Like we had this like date auction thing for charity. And I knew for a fact I was not going to get any bids. And I said, like, the idea of this scares me, so I have to go and do it. And so I got on stage and did it. And the reason I bring that up is I've gotten very good over the years at performing. And that's what I do. I don't think that I'm necessarily any better at being outgoing and being not shy and all these things than I was in high school. I think I just know how to perform it now. And it's funny because 2 years ago, I felt like if you had asked me that question, I would have said, oh, I turned myself into an extrovert. Like I've since realized that's not what happened. I just can act as an extrovert. But what that has caused, the downside of that, is that sometimes when it comes to creating content online, the thing that works, the reason people resonate with things is because they resonate with the person. The content is one thing, but the person and their personality is ultimately what we want. It's the same reason that we have these mega stars like George Clooney and so on and so forth. Like we like him as a person. We like Oprah as a person, or at least what we know of them. And when you've lived the last 10 years sort of putting on this performance, you start to forget what's actually you and what is the performance. And so as I've been looking at moving over to YouTube and doing more things, that success there really relies on being a much more authentic version of myself and being willing to be that person. I've come to realize like I need to sort of peel back these layers of who I am and figure that out, because the act is good and it has allowed me to get this far, but it's not going to take me to the next stage. And I need to be willing to share more of that. And so the biggest struggle for me is, and probably will always be, breaking down this version of who I think I am in order to show more of who I actually am in private and be that silly, weird, ridiculous person without feeling fear around it. Because what I've been doing is putting up this wall so that if somebody judges the act, it doesn't affect me personally. Like that's not me, that's the act. But once I put me out there, if somebody judges that, all of a sudden it might hurt. And I need to be able to come to terms with that before I can get to the next stage that I want to go to.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that it speaks to what a lot of people may be experiencing as well. Sort of this need to put on a facade whenever you walk out of your house or you go to work or, you know, whatever situation that you're in. We're all kind of on this journey of how can we be more kind of in love with our true selves so that when we put 100%. It out there, you know, we're behind it. I would love to hear what kind of advice you'd like to give. I mean, you've done so much research, you have so much experience with this. So, you know, if you could give one piece of advice to other millennials who are moving towards success, wanting to bring in more fulfillment into their lives, what would that be?
So with my book, when that releases, one of the things I tried to do is boil down this process of how to make a change in anything. And it essentially comes down to three things that when you hear them, it's like, oh yeah, I knew that, but most people don't do it. First is to figure out what it is you want. Actually sit down, identify, where do I want to go? And you can do this for any area of your life. You can do it for the smaller areas, do it again for the larger areas. But really understanding like, what is it that I want? Where do I want to be in 5 years? That question. The second piece that no one ever does and no one ever talks about is doing a really honest audit of what your life looks like in comparison to that thing. So this is what I ended up doing in sophomore year. Like, this was the person I was. This was the direction I wanted to go in. And I needed to change that because it wasn't going to add up. So sitting down and being brutally honest as to what actions you're currently taking that either move towards or move away from, and not necessarily like beating yourself up if you're moving away or if you don't spend enough time in an area or whatever it is, but just understanding the reality of it. And then third is simply just making small changes every day that push you in the direction of the thing you want. So a perfect example of this is, let's say I want by this summer to finally have a six-pack. This has been a goal of mine forever, and it doesn't have to last forever. I just want to have it for like a day. But let's say that's my big goal. If I were to do a not so honest audit, a not so brutal audit of my life, I would say that I eat pretty well. I would say that I work out fairly regularly. I would say that I should be on the path to it. But if I were to really break down where my calories are coming from and how much I work out and how into the workout I am when I'm doing it, and just be brutally honest as to the situation I'm in, my actions don't map to that goal. And the only way I can figure that out is if I do that audit and if I'm honest with myself in that audit. And then finally, once I know what my actions do map to and what areas are my weak points, I can just make small changes every day that'll get me there in 3 months. So that's the advice I would give to anyone trying to do anything, whether it's launch a business, have more of an impact, like whatever the thing that millennials want is, you've got to figure that out first. Then you've got to do a really, really honest audit of yourself. How much action are you taking every day? Like, how much are you learning every day? What are you reading? Are you just entertaining yourself after work? Like, you've got to be willing to figure out where your time is actually going and how that maps to the thing you're saying you want. And then from there, it's all about tiny leaps. It's making the smallest changes that make it easy to start change so that life just looks very different. It's that story of, if you cook a lobster, if you boil a lobster and you start it from cold and just slowly increase the heat, they won't realize when it's boiling. That same thing applies to us. Like, if we make very small changes every single day and just make that tiny little bit of progress, 3 months later, our lives will look very different from they did, but we won't even realize it happened.
It's all about those tiny leaps. Love it. Thank you so much. I think that hard self-assessment is really a loving self-assessment too. I think it's saying you
Absolutely.
trust yourself enough. You are powerful enough to hear the truth about where you really are.
And I just want to say one quick thing. That's why whenever I have done this in talks and in the book, I make it very clear. It's not about doing this assessment as this is positive, this is negative. You put no emotions to it whatsoever. You put no like positivity or negativity to it whatsoever. It's just about understanding the reality.
Mm-hmm.
So don't judge yourself based on it, but you need to know it.
Love that. Based on your experience with all the people in the Tiny Leaps community, the feedback you've received over the years in the podcast, the research you've been doing for your book, what are some of the major opportunities or challenges that you see facing the millennial generation specifically? And I know as a generation, it's a pretty broad swath, but I think we are at a certain time frame, and you've had access to a lot more people who are trying to change their lives than most people have. So what kind of things have you noticed that are opportunities for some of these people right now, or some of the challenges you consistently see them facing?
So from what I've seen, there's 3 big areas that people struggle with or people care most about. First is their career. Of course, the millennial generation, I think, is one of the first that really feels this need to have an impact with the work that they do and to be passionate and so on and so forth, and all the cliches around that. I'm a big fan of Cal Newport's view on this of, it's not about finding your passion. It's about doing something, getting good at it, and as a result, gaining passion around it. But that's a big area I've noticed is people want to have more control and understanding around their career and what they're trying to do and how that connects and so on and so forth. The second area, which is related, is finance. Of course, there's trillions of dollars of student loans. I'm personally in over 100K debt of student loans. So there's insane amounts of money owed that is really crippling us in a very major way, many people could view it as motivation. So like I said, I'm 100K in debt. The only way I ever get out of that is if I do really, really, really well. So I better work damn hard to make sure that happens, because I don't intend to die in that debt. So you can view it as motivation, or you can view it as, well, the world sucks. Let me go protest and do X, Y, and Z. But it's still going to exist either way. So take that as you may. But finance is really big piece. We want to have more control over our money. We want to not necessarily have our money tied to any single source, because we saw what happened in 2008. We weren't necessarily directly a part of it, but we saw it happen. And that was a very big lesson for us, I think, in that we weren't sure when we entered graduate college that there were going to be jobs for us to take. We weren't sure that when we entered college, those jobs would be worth anything, like they would pay us anything. Many of our parents lost their jobs. My parents had to put their house in foreclosure as a direct result of the 2008 crisis. And they worked hard their entire lives with this dream of owning a home, finally get it in like 2006, and then they lose it. So we saw that happen to the people we loved, and we recognized you can't trust any single source of income. You can't trust any single person to pay your way through life. You have to have that diversity so that if anything ever happens again, we're protected in some way and we have options. So you've got career, super important, finance, super important. But the third piece is the most important. What I've noticed is the big opportunity for millennials and for anyone of the younger generation, I think it's Zennials or whatever they're called, is our philosophy around the world, the way we think about the world. So one of the things that's happened with our generation is that we're less and less inclined to stake our entire identity on any one group. So there is still, religion and there is still left, right politics. There's still these groups, but I personally know many millennial Republicans that are socially liberal. So like we're less inclined to stake our identity and the way we view the world on any single group. We want to sample all these different things, and that's a good thing. But I also think that where we're lacking is just in how we think about things like money, things like career, things like health, how we think about our role in the world and how that relates back to the rest of the world. So starting to better understand and looking into personal development, because this is often talked about in that space, starting to better understand that we make more money by providing more value. Starting to better understand that we have a better career, not necessarily because we're passionate about it, but because we provide more value. And just starting to understand that the world doesn't care about us. As an individual, Greg Clunas, the world gives no craps about me whatsoever. If I disappear tomorrow from my podcast, maybe for a month or two, the people who listen will wonder what's going on. But eventually they'll forget, because the world doesn't actually care about me. They care about the value that I provide. And whether that's entertainment or teaching or whatever it is, if I stop providing value, I stop getting paid and people stop caring. It's that simple. And when you can recognize that, it's actually very freeing, because you understand that if you screw up, it's really not that bad unless it's like some Harvey Weinstein level stuff. Like you don't want to go that route. But if you screw up in a much lesser way, like if you fail, quote unquote, no one's going to remember in 5 years if you're providing value then. So really starting to wrap your head around that and just change your philosophy around your role in the world would dramatically change, I think, those first two pieces of how do we navigate the career space and how do we make sure we're protected if there's ever another crash, which there probably will be at some point.
Those are some really powerful insights. Thank you so much for sharing that and for being here to share all of what I would argue is wisdom. And
well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Before we wrap up here, would you share with the audience where they can connect with you and your work online?
Sure. So the easiest thing, you're listening to this podcast, just click over, do a quick search for Tiny Leaps, Big Changes. It's got a big orange background. The text is super large. It's not well designed, but it's clear. Go give that a listen and just listen to like 3-4 episodes. They're 10 minutes long, so you'll be fine. And then if you like it, reach out to me on Twitter, on Instagram at Greg Clunas, and feel free to join our Facebook community. Just do a quick search on Facebook for Tiny Leaps. and you'll find that. But definitely listen to the show. That's the first step.
Yeah, we'll co-sign that. I've loved listening to Greg's episodes over the years, and each one is just a beautiful, concise burst of something that will actually help you on a practical level, and is phenomenal. And Greg, you mentioned that you're working on consolidating things into a personal brand. Does that have a name or a title, or is it going to be under your name?
Yeah, just under my name. So basically, as part of this, I mentioned earlier of trying to be more of myself, my real raw self. As part of doing that, Tiny Leaps will obviously remain Tiny Leaps. Pod Simply will remain Pod Simply, but all of that will be funneled through Greg Clunas. Like, those are projects of Greg Clunas. And Blake, before we jumped on, we're talking about the mixtape I want to release. Like, that'll be a project, and it'll be this role of Greg Clunas creates these different projects that maybe have slightly different audiences, but they're the things I care about and want to create, and hopefully other people find them interesting.
That's great.
Perfect. I just got to give a shout. Greg's going to drop a hot mixtape. It doesn't have a title yet, but if
oh, it does. It's going to be called Legendary.
Legendary.
Is it legend? Wait for it, dairy, or is it just?
No, it's just the word legendary.
Excellent.
That's awesome.
Okay, we'll keep an eye out for that. And
now I've actually got to do it.
Collabo, that's the next step, man. We'll trade bars.
100%.
Awesome. Well, Greg, thanks for taking the time to be with us today. Love the work you're doing. Love the community. Love your spirit. And we appreciate you being on the Motivational Millennial Podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Blake and Ivy.
For show notes and previous episodes, or to learn more about our coaching and event offerings, visit motivationalmillennial.com. That's millennial, MILLENNIAL. Keep in touch with us at facebook.com/motivationalmillennial.
We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email with your thoughts, comments, and suggestions at podcast@motivationalmillennial.com. And tell us who you might like to hear from, or if you think you or anyone you know would be good for the show.
Our theme music was composed and performed by our very own Blake Brandis.
The Motivational Millennial Podcast is edited by Brittany Felix. Have a great week, Motivational Millennials!